of the week, President Trump indicated that the United States was going to stick to hitting military targets. And by today, if the Iranians had not surrendered, he would hit power plants, bridges, and what are commonly referred to as civilian targets. And he would do that because he was desperate and he had to get the Iranians to surrender. But what happened is that towards the end of last week, he started hitting power plants, bridges, and oil facilities inside of Iran. Now, the question is, what did the Iranians do? The Iranians responded in kind. They went after desalination plants and power stations in Kuwait, and they did the same thing in Bahrain. And they made it very clear that if President Trump wanted to escalate, to hit civilian infrastructure, they'd do the same thing. Moreover, this is very important, they said if this coming week, the week it's starting today, Australia time, if that happened, they would go after all sorts of targets in Saudi Arabia and in the UAE, as well as the targets that they have been going after. And they would go after more power plants, more desalination plants, and they would try to shut down completely the flow of oil out of Saudi Arabia and the UAE. So what President Trump did on Sunday night was he attacked Iran once again, but he stopped hitting civilian targets. He stopped going after bridges and power plants. And I actually think, Tom, and I'm not sure this is true, but I think the reason that President Trump did not go after bridges and power plants on Sunday night was he was deterred by Iran's actions, by what he saw happen last week at the end of the week, and what he knows the Iranians have promised to do this coming week if he really ups the ante and goes after civilian targets.
But surely he would bear that in mind.
You certainly would think that, Tom, and this is why I don't understand what these people are thinking. What's also happened this past week is that for the first time, the Iranians have started bombing targets in Jordan. Jordan was not on the target list for most of this tit-for-tat campaign, and certainly during the air war, the 40-day air war. But what's happened here is that the United States has moved a lot of military assets out of places like Kuwait and Bahrain and put them in Jordan. So Jordan has now become a big fat target. And of course, the United States bases and military equipment that is in Jordan is a big fat target for the Iranians. And this past week, they went after Jordan big time. Now, I say to myself, didn't the Trump administration understand that this is exactly what would happen? But apparently they didn't. And I think, by the way, the fact that the Iranians have really pounded Jordan, the American install, a huge liability. They're like a giant magnet. I mean, why do you think the Israelis have tried to not get involved in the fight? Because the Israelis understood full well if they get involved in the fight, the Iranians will target Israel. And despite all this talk about all these wonderful defenses that Israel has for shooting down missiles and shooting down drones, we know from the 12-day war last year, and we know from what happened in the 40-day campaign at the start of this war, that the Israelis can only knock down a small number of those drones and missiles. So the Israelis don't want to get pounded. And I would bet, Tom, I'd bet a considerable amount of money that the Gulf states have been calling President Trump over the past few days, telling him in no uncertain terms that the last thing they want is for him to go after civilian infrastructure, those power stations, desalination plants, and bridges, and so forth and so on this coming week, because those Gulf states understand full well if that happens, those countries may be literally wrecked.
And of course, we shouldn't be surprised.
I would just note, Tom, that President Trump himself said he didn't want to be Herbert Hoover and that he was worried about an economic catastrophe. So it wasn't just people like us who were warning about taking the international economy off a cliff. He seemed to understand full well. And this rhetoric of his was used to justify why he signed the Memorandum of Understanding on June 17th.
Which you called a surrender document.
Yes, which was a surrender document. But for some reason, decided after June 17th that he could push the Iranians around, and he could in effect violate the Memorandum of Understanding. Article 5 said, in my opinion, quite clearly, that Iran would be responsible for controlling the Strait of Hormuz for the 60-day negotiation period. And after that, Oman and Iran would negotiate a deal for controlling the strait. The United States is not mentioned at all. Nevertheless, after June 17th, after the Memorandum of Understanding is in place, President Trump decided that he was going to open a U.S.-controlled channel through the Gulf. And needless to say, the Iranians said this was unacceptable. They fired at some ships that came through that American-controlled channel, and that led to this new tit-for-tat campaign. President Trump had to know that that was going to happen. And you then say to yourself, well, if he knew that was going to happen, why did he start, in effect, this tit-for-tat campaign? It just makes no strategic sense. And then you say to yourself, well, he must have had a new theory of victory. He must have thought that he now had an advantage after June 17th that he didn't have before June 17th. Of course, neither you or I can figure out what that advantage is, nor anybody else I've listened to. So the end result is he's in the same mess today that he was in before June 17th.
What complicates things further, John, and he would be
absolutely. I'm actually surprised that he's engaged in this tit-for-tat campaign for that reason. And let me make 2 points about that, Tom. One is, I think this is why the air campaign will remain a tit-for-tat campaign and will not escalate to a major strategic bombing campaign like we saw earlier, right?
Yeah, this period from late February to early to mid-April.
Yes, exactly. From February 28th to April 8th, the 40-day bombing campaign, strategic bombing. I don't think we will escalate back to that, in large part because of what you said about the munitions problem we face. Second point I would make to you, Tom, is I think that the reason that Trump said that this coming week he's going to go after civilian infrastructure is because he's desperate to end this war. He just can't go on week after week in a tit-for-tat strategy that doesn't bring the Iranians to their knees because the munitions are not there. You follow what I'm saying? So I think that the reason that Trump was very interested in going to escalated tit-for-tat strategy this coming week. And by the way, Tom, as I said to you earlier in the program, he actually started escalating and going against civilian infrastructure at the end of last week. And I think he did that because he knows he's got to put an end to the tit-for-tat because of the munitions shortage that we face. So I just say to myself, this can't go on that long. Something has to give from our side. I don't think so. You know, it's very funny, Tom. If you go back to the 40-day war, and you think about what the mainstream media in the West was saying, and this would include countries like Australia as well as the United States, what we were reading was that the U.S. and Israeli air forces were tearing apart the missile and drone capability inside of Iran. And furthermore, that almost every missile and drone that the Iranians fired at American bases in the region or at Israel were being shot down. And sounded as the war was going on as if we were on the verge of winning a great victory in the strategic bombing campaign. We have since learned, however, that the Iranian missiles and drones got through. They weren't shot down. And this is why everybody says that the Iranians did enormous damage, if not destruction, to American bases in the region. It's now clear that Israel was badly hit and that they shot down very few of the incoming ballistic missiles and drones. And at the same time, it's now clear that not that many Iranian missiles and drones were destroyed, that they have them buried deep in mountains or in other underground sites, and we were incapable of destroying them. So there is no evidence at this point in time that the Iranians are running out of missiles. It's us, the United States, that's running out of sophisticated weapons that we depend on. And furthermore, when it comes to